Hey everybody, and welcome back to a new video. Do you have a problem with photos that come out too dark or too light, blown out whites or blacks crushed so dark you can't see any detail? In this video, I'm going to teach you my best tricks for getting the photo to come out the right brightness by mastering exposure. Be sure to stay for my bonus tip, where I'll show you the trick to get the very best exposure and image quality at the same time, a technique called ETTR, or exposed to the right. My name is Simon D'Entremont, and I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. Let's start by learning the fundamentals. Getting the right exposure is getting the right amount of light on your sensor so that the image comes out well exposed, that is, an appropriate brightness. The two ways that you can get more light on your sensor is via longer shutter speeds and larger apertures, both of which allow more photons to get onto your sensor. You want to try to get as much light as you can into your camera, as it will improve your image quality. You may be saying, what about ISO? That's actually not changing the amount of light. It's a volume or gain knob on the brightness of the photo added by your camera after the photo is taken. If that sounds confusing, check out my video on that right here, but come back. In short, while the ISO isn't changing the actual exposure, that is the amount of light, it does affect the final image brightness, so we will be including it in this discussion as one of the variables to play with, even though the scientific definition says that exposure is the amount of light captured, which only aperture and shutter speed can affect. Okay? Now, while you can eyeball how well exposed your photo is, one of the best means of evaluating the appropriateness of exposure is the histogram, which graphically displays the brightness of the pixels in your image. Dark tones are shown over here, lighter tones over here, and the middle tones here. If your photo is too bright, it will be squished up on the right. The right edge of your histogram represents the brightest tones that your camera can record. If you touch the right edge with your photo, it's pure white, what we call blown out. If you touch the left-hand edge, it's pure black, sometimes called having crushed your blacks. The height of the peaks is just how many pixels of a certain brightness there are, and can largely be ignored for this discussion. So here in Lightroom, I can slide the exposure slider up and down to make the histogram go right and left. So if I lower the brightness of a photo, it moves the body of the histogram data left until I've crushed the darks. If I brighten a photo, I move the peaks right until they hit the right-hand side of the histogram and get blown out. I'm going to show you how to purposefully manipulate this in your camera before you take the photo to get your exposure right. While pure whites and pure blacks can be used creatively for beautiful photos, for most photographers, getting the right exposure means taking a photo without pure whites nor pure blacks, that is, staying between the goalposts of the histogram. By the way, there is no such thing as a perfect histogram shape you should shoot for. The tip that the histogram should look like a mountain with a peak in the middle is false. Dark images will have a peak to the left and bright images a peak to the right, and that's perfectly okay. First off, let's get the histogram showing on your camera to help you. On a mirrorless camera, the histogram can be seen right in the viewfinder. Most cameras have a setting in your menus to enable this. On a DSLR, you need to put your camera into live view. On a Canon, hit the info button until the histogram shows up. On a Sony, hit display. On a Nikon, press info. And on a Fuji, enable it in your display custom settings menu. If your histogram isn't showing up, you may have to enable it in your camera menu. Okay, let's move on to nailing that exposure. Let's start off in full manual for this first scenario. My strategy is the following. We have three variables to play with to affect the brightness of the photo: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. The trick is to have two settings that you set intentionally to get the photo you want. For example, shutter speeds to freeze the action, and fast aperture for a thin depth of field. And to use the third setting as your tweak setting to change the brightness of the photo without affecting your creative choices. So let's say the light is generous and my subject isn't moving. So a low ISO of 100 is possible, and getting a thin depth of field on my owl buddy here is what I want, so f2.8. Now I've left shutter speed as my tweaking variable. Changing it won't affect the creative look of my photo, only its brightness. So the shutter speed dial is now the dial we're going to play with to get the exposure right. You can see that at this shutter speed, the image is too dark. I need to lengthen the shutter speed to get more light on the sensor. and I do that until the histogram shows peaks between the goalposts. I don't care what the shutter speed is in this scenario, so I make it whatever is needed. It's great that there's rarely a penalty for too much shutter speed. Crank it high like 1/4000th of a second if you need to. But let's say shooting at 1/100th of a second was the minimum I thought I needed to get a sharp photo, but that I don't care about the depth of field and the blurriness of the background. As such, I could use the aperture setting to be my tweak setting. I control that here, and smaller apertures, which are larger f numbers, will make the image darker, and larger apertures will make it brighter. Here I adjust the aperture until the data is between the goalposts. Now if the shutter speed and the aperture are both critical to the shot that you want, then use the ISO to be your tweak settings. For my wildlife shots, I need minimum shutter speeds to freeze my subjects, and I like shooting at a large aperture for a shallow depth of field. So I use the ISO as my tweak settings, like I'm doing here. If my ISO needs to get too high to get the image the right brightness, then I need to lower the shutter speed to let in more light. By the way, if you sign up for my email list, I'll send you a free guide on how to shoot in backlit situations. Link in the comments below. Now for semi-automatic modes like shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual with auto ISO, things are different. That's because you will control two settings and the camera will adjust the third automatically to try to get the exposure right for you between the goalposts. It will do this by trying to get the middle of your histogram at what's called 18% gray, a gray that reflects 18% of light. But it may not always get this right. To the rescue comes exposure compensation. This is the dial that we will be using to adjust and tweak the exposure to get it where we want. If you shoot in shutter priority, TV, that means you've decided that getting the shutter speed right is what's critical. So you'll pick the shutter speed and ISO, and the camera will pick the aperture for you. If you don't think it's done a good enough job automatically, use the exposure compensation dial to move the brightness lighter and darker like I'm doing here. The adjustable parameter in shutter priority is the aperture, so that's what will be adjusted when you move the exposure compensation dial. If you shoot in aperture priority, AV, that means that the aperture you're setting is the critical piece you want to control, and that it's okay for the camera to play with the shutter speed to get the exposure right. Again, if it doesn't get it just right, use the exposure compensation dial to set it properly. It will adjust the shutter speed accordingly. And if you shoot in manual with auto ISO, my personal favorite, I set the shutter speed and the aperture, which are both important to me, and I let the camera set the ISO. If it doesn't get it just right, I use exposure compensation to tweak it to be where I want it, between the goalposts. See here as I adjust it. What's your favorite exposure tip? Let us know in the comments below. Now, what if after playing with the settings, you can't seem to get all of the data of the histogram between the goalposts? It always seems to hit up against the side. That happens when the scene has too much dynamic range for your camera to capture. That is, the difference between the darkest darks and the lightest lights are too great. You have three choices here. One, you can expose those that the right hand doesn't touch, but the left hand does. That means you have pure blacks. Or two, you can expose that the left doesn't touch, but the right does, so you'll have pure whites, that is blown out highlights. You need to decide which of these two options is best for your photo. Sometimes it's okay, so don't despair. These photos have pure whites and pure blacks, and it's still okay. The center of the sun in this photo is blown out too. No biggie. You decide if what's lost is critical. The third option is to use exposure bracketing. That's where you take 3 photos of different brightnesses and combine them digitally to get the best parts of all the photos, but put together. Many programs like Lightroom can do this automatically for you. Now, one way to squeak out the very best image quality out of your exposure is to use a technique called expose to the right, known as ETTR. This means exposing your photo bunched over to the right, but without touching the right-hand side. There are 3 reasons this is helpful. First, digital camera sensors record data in a way that the brighter toned areas have more capacity to record data than the darker toned areas. Photos that are darker have less data. Second, noise comes from a lack of light, and darker parts are more noisy than lighter parts, even in the same image. To raise the exposure of these darker areas makes them less noisy. And third, shooting a photo too dark and raising the exposure in processing makes the photo noise more apparent, where the opposite, shooting too bright and lowering the brightness in processing, doesn't do the same. It actually makes noise less apparent, especially in shadowy areas. So the technique here is adjust the exposure to the right part of the histogram as far as you can go, but without touching the right hand side. This is critical to not clipping your highlights. But there are a few other tips to make this work. This works best if you use the aperture and shutter speed to move the histogram right rather than the ISO, because the two former ones are actual sources of light and will actually improve image quality. 2, this will work better in RAW rather than shooting in JPEG. In JPEG, your camera may try to undo what you're trying to do here, and in RAW, there is more tonal data, that is dynamic range to play with, and less risk of clipping the whites. And 3, these images will come out a bit too bright, so they'll need processing to look their best and be what you had envisaged as a photo. But the benefit is that you'll have more data to play with, the best dynamic range, the least noise, and the best colors. Just be careful not to clip that right-hand side. Turn on highlight alerts or blinkies to make sure. If you want to learn more about exposure compensation and how to use it, check out my video on that, which you can see right here. If you found this video deserving, give it a like and YouTube will share it with other photographers, helping them get the right exposure every time and coming home with their own unique, amazing photos. I hope you can go out the very next outing yourself and come home with perfectly exposed photos. I know you can do it.